Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to memorize a speech and show you different methods of doing it using memory techniques. Let's go. Now, the difficulty people have in remembering a speech is when you're trying to deliver, you're always trying to recall what you're trying to say, and people can see that. People can see that your eyes are moving that way and you're trying to remember, or you're stressing out trying to remember those important bits that you really want to get across. And sometimes you just don't, because you get into a different momentum or you get into a different context. Whatever it is, you don't get everything out that you want. So that's another problem people generally have when they're speaking. But the number one thing generally when people come to me is, I just want to be able to remember my speech. You know, I've got a speech to X amount of people and I don't want to stuff it up. So we've got to talk, right? And our talk has many different points. Right? No matter how long your talk is, whether it's 2 minutes or whether it's 4 hours, it doesn't matter, because you're going to have a set of points that you're going to talk about, right? So if you don't know your points, I suggest you get out a notepad or your laptop or something like that and just make the dots of what you're going to talk about. That's obvious, right? The obvious step is write down what you're going to talk about, right? It doesn't even have to be in order, just as long as you dump it. Then you can rearrange the order and try and make sense of it before you even start to memorize, right? So that's the first. I'm not going to go through how to do that because we're sort of assuming that you've got your talk, right? You've got your points, you've got your talk, and so on. All the organization stuff, make sure that's already done. Now, because you've got all your points there in your talk, right? You want to memorize them, and the worst way of really memorizing is rote learning, where you're trying to repeat all this information over and over and over and over again, expecting that you'll memorize it perfectly. That's not the case, right? So what we need to do is we need to not just memorize points, but maybe there's sub-points in between all these things, right? You might have 1 or 2, you might have 5, right? So there's a lot to remember, right? It's some talks. Now, obviously, the simpler the better. When I present, I don't have many sub-points or anything like that. I just keep it really simple. But, we'll talk more about speaking strategies another time. This video is just going to focus more on how to remember your presentation, right? Your speaking notes, all that sort of stuff. So let's go. So you've got your talk here. You've got your number of points. You're all set to memorize. How do you do it, right? There's a technique that I'll put in the comments below or in the description on how to memorize using a memory palace. That is one method, right? Now, the memory palace, for those that you haven't come across in my previous videos or seen anything or read anything about it, is that it's just a holding spot for information in a sequential order. So it's like folders on your computer that goes in order, and then all you have to do is put the information into those folders, walk away, and then whenever you need to retrieve something, you can come back to it and retrieve perfectly because you know the order of where that information is, right? So that's what essentially a memory palace, method of loci, journey system, whatever you want to call it, that's what that is. And we want to use that today for this. So how do we do it? If you've seen my video, what I do is I create locations around a familiar point. And I use the example of my house. So what I do is I pick a point in my house, and I usually start from the start, and I say this is going to be location 1. So location 1 in my house, I've got a fence. So I'll put location 1 is my front fence. Then I'll step in, I'll say, okay, what's the next thing that I see? I see my front door. So I'll say location 2, front door, step into my house. I've got like a living area, bedroom. Now, instead of saying living area or bedroom, right, it's too broad. I want to pick a specific item, right? So I go into my bedroom, let's say, and I pick bed. That's my 3rd location. My 4th location might be, I open a door and it leads onto a shower, then a sink, then a toilet, and so on. So I just go one by one in order of what I see and put location 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you can go on to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 if you wanted to. Right, so this is a very quick rundown of a memory palace. And again, if you want to watch the full thing, I suggest you click down below and watch the full thing because it'll just make sense. we're going to use the memory palace to remember these key points. Now, if your talk has, let's say, I don't know, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Cool. If your talk has 10 points, 10 key points, and there's obviously stuff you know underneath, then what you need to do is create 10 locations to store them in. For example, my location 1, like I said, is my front fence. So I won't write down fence. You assume, we know what location 1 is for me. So front fence, and that's my first point. Let's say my talk is about memory. I'll keep it simple since I'm a memory guy, right? The first thing I generally get up and talk about is an introduction, right? Introduce the talk, introduce myself. Generally, it's myself, right? So what I have to do is I have to make a story with introduction and my first location. So it all works with stories. If you haven't, again, seen my videos, watch them, because you'll know that storytelling and encoding using imagery works best for memorization. So we're going to tell a story. So introduction, I'm introducing myself to the front fence. Right? I'm saying, hi, front fence. My name's Tansel. We've never met before, blah, 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 blah. Or we've met, for a very long time. I haven't introduced myself. Again, I'm pretty much being silly, right? The sillier it is, the more you're going to remember from that association. So I'm introducing myself to the fence. Maybe I'm touching the fence, holding on, saying, how you going? Because the more interaction you have, the more senses you use, the more you're going to remember it, right? So there's my little introduction. Now, I sort of know what's in my introduction. I don't have to really memorize it, but we'll get to that stage as well, like I talked about the sub sort of areas. Now, next one, right? That's my location 2. That's my front door. And I might get into maybe my story, right? So usually introducing myself, and then I get into my story. And my story generally starts with me being a skeptic in memory improvement, right? I used to watch a lot of late night television. It was David Letterman back then. So I used to watch late night television and used to watch people memorize all these names and faces. And I think, I used to think they were just fake, right? Just to sell it was cassette tapes back then. Gee, I feel old now, right? So my story and the front door, right? So it gets a little bit harder, right? So I think, okay, how do I visualize my story? And what I could do is I can have maybe a picture storybook that's got my face on it, right? And I smash it onto the door, right? It might seem a bit violent, these associations, but trust me, they work. It doesn't have to be violent. You could be all happy and, unicorns and fairy dust and all that sort of stuff. Like I open a book and, sparkles and glitter come out, but that's not really me. I'm more of a blood and guts type of guy. So, I open a book, throw my story, and somehow, the book sticks onto the front door and it's got my face on there, maybe smiling. So again, it may not be the best association, right? But it's something that's going to help me remember it. So that's my story. Now my third location, right, might be, I'm going to start talking about memory techniques, right? And maybe I'll talk about the memory palace. So my third location, that was the bed, right? So now I have to say, okay, memory palace and bed. What story can I make with memory palace and bed? And that could be an easy one. I could have a little replica of a palace on my bed, right? And that's it. And then someone comes and wrecks it. Probably one of my kids comes and wrecks the palace on my bed. That's an easy one because I can visualize it. I can see what it looks like on my bed. And again, if I interact with it, if I play with the palace on the bed's a bit bouncy, or maybe I accidentally slip on it or lie on it, right? Can you imagine lying on a piece of whatever it is, a model on your back, and it's stuck in my back. Right? Again, the more you feel, the more you're going to remember. That's what you do. You go through then, what am I doing? L4, you can tell I'm a visual learner. Location 4, do the same thing with another keyboard, do the same thing with another keyword, and so on. So you keep doing that, and you could have maybe 10, 20 locations, whatever it is. And then all you have to do is go back to the start, once you've made all those stories, and say, okay, my first location, what was happening, right? So I go to my front fence. What was I doing? I was introducing myself to my front fence. Ooh, okay. my name is Tansel. So there you go. So the first thing that I do when I get up in front of people, right, it's usually about 500 odd people, is, hi, my name's Tansel. You know, some people call me Tinsel, Tonsil, or yell out, hey, you Tansel. I try and crack a bit of a joke, right? It's getting, more towards dad jokes these days, but anyway. Then number 2 was my front door, and I remembered my story straight away because I threw it there, and I gave a really bad example of, sparkling glitter and unicorns, and oh man. I've got my story, so I start talking about, how I was a skeptic and how I got involved and who introduced me and the books I read, blah, 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 blah. Very small, couple of minutes there. And then number 3, I go into my bed and, there's a memory palace, right? A palace, model palace on my bed. And I accidentally lied down on it, right? And it hurt. Then I start talking about the memory palace and introducing it. There you go. That's one method. And all you have to do is go through each one. Make sure you make a really good story, because if you forget, it just means you haven't made a really strong story for your memorization, right? So the key to memory is making strong connection, right? Use your senses, use emotion, use color, use exaggeration. If you watch my Smash and Scope videos, go and do that as well. But generally all you have to do is create the locations and you're set, right? That's really all there is. Now, do I use this technique? No, I don't. I don't use the memory palace to memorize speeches. And I do a lot of speeches, and I've spoken all around the world. I don't use this. Sometimes I've held 8-hour workshops where I'm speaking all day, and I still haven't used this. Why? Because there is another technique that I use, and I'll go through that with you in another video. But for now, see if you can use this. Practice it. Create your locations, get a few points of your talk, what you want to say. Now, again, we talked about, well, what about if you need to know what's inside all these key areas? That's a good question that I get. But the thing is, most of the time, what's underneath there. So the trick is to understand what you're going to talk about, not memorize it, because you can memorize something and still don't know, right? Whereas if you understand what you're communicating, you could say it in many different ways. If you're just going for memory, well, if you don't memorize it in the way that it's written, you're going to forget it completely, right? So that's a really big one. So understand what that's about, and that'll help you remember these. If you can't remember these, again, you can just continue the story along. So for example, let's use location number 4, right? I'm going to say the shower. So I've gone into my ensuite from the bed. I've got a shower there. Now, maybe the next bullet point is I'm going to talk about how to use a memory palace, right? So how do I use a memory palace? And maybe there's steps on how to use it, right? So create the order, then it's make a story on it, and then recall. I might pick those 3. So I start from 4 and I talk about the uses of memory palace, right? So what does that look like first? First, I have to encode the looking part of a memory palace. Right, so what does a memory palace look like in my shower? Right, it looks really wet. So because I've got a wet memory palace, that's an image. Then I have to create another story now with how do I use that memory palace in a sequence. So what I might do, because I've got the memory palace in a shower, I might put the pieces in order. So you put the pieces in order, and as you're putting the pieces in order, you're telling your brain that, this is the first section of creating sequential order for memory palace. That's what you're doing. And then what you're doing is saying, okay, I have to make a story for each one. What does that look like? So maybe again, I picture a storybook for stories for some reason, right? So for every piece, you put down a storybook for each one. And maybe each one has a different storybook, right? So you visualize that. And then the final bit is recall. So all you can visualize yourself doing is maybe turning around in the shower and seeing if you can remember what those storybooks to those locations were. Now, like I said, it doesn't have to be the best stories and associations when you're connecting things together, because what you can do, you can always improve as you're going through the story. So let's say you made those connections here. You're not just going to make them once and walk away. You're going to go and refine and make those stories better. Like my front fence, I had myself touching it after a while, right? And speaking to it intimately. So So same thing here as well. If I don't remember these sub areas, I just extend the story out and that's it. That's a way of remembering all. If you've got any sub ones, then you need to rethink your life choices, right? You shouldn't be speaking in multiple levels like that. It's about simplification. If you need more explanations on this, I know it is a longer topic and I don't want to make the video too long, but if you need further explanation, you can always contact me and message me and I can talk to you about it, or I can give you further detail explanation as well. But for now, Memory Palace, get your keywords in there, memorize it in order, obviously, and then test yourself, recall, see how you're going. And that's one way of remembering a speech. I've used this with a number of my clients and they're able to remember their speeches perfectly. Like I said, there's another technique as well. I'll show you that next. So speak to you soon. Cheers.